8 seconds. That is the gap I want you to hold in your mind for the next 20 minutes, because everything about the Canada-US trade war right now lives inside those 8 seconds. Not in a press conference that ran for 40 minutes. Not in a 300-page trade document that nobody outside a law firm has read all the way through. Not in the carefully managed diplomatic language that fills the space between two countries who are supposed to be allies and currently behave like strangers who share a wall and have agreed not to discuss it. 8 seconds, spoken by one man, on a tarmac at Paris Orly Airport, on his way home from a summit where he had just spent several days telling the world exactly what he thought of the trade deal holding North America together. And in those 8 seconds, he managed to say two things that directly contradict each other, not subtly. Not in a way that requires a trade lawyer and a magnifying glass to detect. Openly. In the same breath. On camera, for the entire world to hear, he said he would rather CUSMA expire immediately, and then he said he may sign it. Now, if you only caught the headline version of that moment, you probably filed it under Trump says another confusing thing about Canada and moved on with your day. I understand why. There has been so much noise in this trade fight for so long that a single contradictory statement at an airport feels like just another frame in a film that has been running for 18 months. But I want to make the case to you today that those 8 seconds are not noise. They are signal. In fact, I think they are the clearest signal this entire confrontation has produced in months, and almost nobody reporting on it has explained what that signal actually means. So that is what we are going to do together today. We are going to slow those 8 seconds down, pull them apart, and show you exactly what they reveal about where the leverage in this trade fight actually lives right now. And I promise you, the real story is not the one that got written in the hours after Trump landed. Let me start where any honest breakdown of this moment has to start, which is with the context that the Orly Airport clip completely strips away. Because Trump did not walk off Air Force One into a vacuum. He walked off it into the middle of the most consequential week in Canadian-American trade relations since this deal was signed. The July 1st deadline for the CUSMA review had been circling on every calendar from Ottawa to Washington for the better part of a year. And in the days leading up to Trump's airport statement, the situation had reached the kind of pressure point where the emotional weather in the room starts mattering as much as the actual negotiating positions. The United States ambassador to Canada, Pete Hoekstra, had just gone on television and said the two sides were not anywhere close to a deal. Think about what that means coming from the man whose literal job is to project optimism about the relationship. Ambassadors do not casually admit that negotiations are stalled. That is not in the handbook. When an ambassador uses the words "not anywhere close" with a public deadline 3 days away, he is not describing a negotiation. He is describing a pressure campaign. And on top of that, Trump had already spent the better part of the previous 10 days escalating his public rhetoric about the deal in ways that seemed designed to generate maximum uncertainty. He said he was not looking to renew it. He called it a deal he had always had mixed feelings about. He suggested that it should expire, that he had signed it primarily to escape NAFTA, rather than because he believed in what it contained, and that if he had his way, the whole thing might just be allowed to quietly dissolve. Every one of those statements landed in the Canadian press like a small explosion, because every one of them was designed to. That is the entire strategy. Create enough uncertainty that the other side starts running worst-case math. And once they are running worst-case math, they start making concessions just to end the uncertainty. It is a classic pressure play, and it has a name. Most people who study negotiation call it manufactured urgency. Trump calls it the art of the deal. But here is the thing about manufactured urgency that gets missed every single time. It has a built-in expiration date. And that expiration date is not the calendar deadline. The manufactured urgency expires the moment the other side stops believing the urgency is real. And that is where the 8 seconds at Orly Airport becomes so revealing. Because they do not just expose a contradiction in Trump's public messaging. They expose the ceiling of the strategy itself. Let me take you through exactly what was said, because the sequence matters enormously, and the clips that circulated chopped the sequence up in ways that made it very easy to miss. Trump was speaking to reporters at the airport on his way back from the G7 in France. He was asked about CUSMA and whether he intended to terminate it. And he gave an answer that, if you were watching carefully, should have raised every eyebrow in the room. He said he would rather leave it unsigned. He said he would rather have it terminated. He said, and I want you to hear this specific phrasing, that he viewed the agreement as possibly expiring immediately. Those are not ambiguous words. Expire immediately. That is as close to a termination threat as Trump has come in this entire cycle without actually sending the 6 months written notice that the agreement requires. If someone close to you said they would rather leave your relationship terminated and possibly expiring immediately, you would not describe that as ambiguous. You would describe it as a statement of intent. And then, in the same answer, within 8 seconds of everything I just described, he said, "I would rather not have the agreement, but I may sign it. I may sign it." Not "I will not sign it." Not "I am planning to terminate it." Not "the 6 months notice is being drafted as we speak. I may sign it." The conditional. The hedge. The deliberate insertion of possibility right in the middle of a sentence that was supposed to be a declaration of opposition. And here is the part that nobody in the airport pool seemed to press on, which I think is the most important press question of this entire trade fight so far. If you would rather the deal expire immediately, if you would rather leave it unsigned, if you have always had serious reservations about it, why are you telling us you may sign it? Why does a man who is announcing his preference for termination feel the need to leave the door open? You do not leave a door open to something you genuinely do not want to walk through. You close it. You lock it. You tell people the door is closed and you move on. The fact that Trump did not close it, that he specifically used the word may in the same breath as expire immediately, is the tell. That is the whole story folded into a single 8-second moment that most coverage walked straight past. Now, to understand why this matters so much, you need to understand what this kind of deal actually means to the American economy, not the Canadian one. Because the pressure campaign has been built almost entirely on the premise that Canada needs this agreement desperately, that Canada is the dependent party, that Canada sends roughly 3/4 of everything it makes across the border, and therefore Canada has more to lose if the whole thing comes apart. That premise has been the foundation of every threat, every deadline, every escalating statement for the better part of 2 years. And it is not entirely wrong. Canada does send an enormous share of its exports to the United States. That is a real number, and it represents real vulnerability. But the premise has two very significant problems that tend to get lost in the noise, and both of them were sitting in the airport at Orly with Trump when he spoke those 8 seconds. The first problem is that dependency is not a one-way street. Yes, Canada depends on the United States as a customer, but the United States depends on Canada as a supplier in ways that are embedded so deep in the structure of the American economy that unwinding them is not a political decision. It is a physical one. The energy that heats the Northern American grid, the critical minerals that go into the manufacturing base Trump wants to rebuild, the aluminum that goes into American aircraft and American cars and American consumer products of every description, the potash that feeds American farms, the uranium that powers American nuclear plants. These are not discretionary imports. They are inputs into industries that cannot simply find alternative suppliers overnight at any price. When Trump says CUSMA should expire immediately, he is saying the supply chains that American manufacturers have spent decades building around predictable cross-border access should expire immediately. And the companies that built those supply chains, the manufacturers, the farmers, the automakers, the steel processors, they have been standing up in Washington for months, saying in very plain language that this idea is a serious threat to American jobs, American production, and American prices. Not Canadian ones, American ones. The second problem with the dependency premise is the political math, and this is the one that I think really explains the may sign it. Look at the numbers that were sitting on the table at the moment. Trump spoke at Orly. American inflation had just come in at 4.2% for May, the highest reading in 3 years. Trump's approval rating was averaging below 40%. The Republican Party was holding the House and Senate by margins so thin that a handful of competitive districts could flip the entire balance of power in November. And in that environment, something happened that almost no analysis connected to the Orly Airport statement, but absolutely should be. House Republicans voted against Trump's tariffs on Canada. Members of his own party, representing constituents who live in the manufacturing districts and agricultural counties that are most directly exposed to a trade disruption with Canada, looked at the political math and decided that opposing their own president on this specific issue was worth the risk. That does not happen in a political environment where the president's trade pressure campaign is working. That happens when the people who would normally cover for the strategy can see the damage it is doing to their own voters. Trump does not need Canada to agree that his threats are serious. He needs American voters to believe that his trade pressure is making their lives better. And at 4.2% inflation and a 40% approval rating, that argument is getting harder to make every single week. This is the wall that the may sign it ran into. Not a wall that Carney built. Not a wall that some Canadian trade lawyer constructed in a conference room in Ottawa. A wall that the American economy built, brick by brick, through months of tariffs and uncertainty and supply chain disruption that American businesses and American workers are now paying for in their daily costs. Every threat to terminate CUSMA has to be weighed against the question of who absorbs the blow in the first 6 months. And the answer to that question increasingly runs through Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and the other states whose voters will decide whether Republicans hold the House in November. The threat is not free. It never was. But it is getting more expensive with every passing month. And Trump said so without meaning to when he inserted the words, "I may sign it," into a sentence that was supposed to be about termination. Now, I want to tell you about something that happened in the days around the Orly statement that I think is the most revealing data point of this entire stretch of the trade fight, and it has received almost no serious analysis. On June 24th, the day before his press conference in Ottawa, Prime Minister Carney revealed that he had a phone call with Trump, a long one. An hour, he said, covering a range of issues, some related to NATO, some related to the situation in Iran and the broader Middle East. And then Carney said something that, if you were watching quickly, might have sounded like a slip, or an omission, or even a mistake. He confirmed that CUSMA was not one of the issues they discussed. A sitting prime minister, 3 days before the July 1st deadline on his country's most important trade agreement, had a 1-hour phone call with the President of the United States and did not raise the trade deal. Let that land, because the critics jumped on it immediately. Several commentators framed it as evidence that Carney had failed, that he had squandered an opportunity, that he had gone into the most important phone call of the trade fight and come out with nothing to show for it. And I understand the instinct, because on the surface, it looks exactly like what they described. But I want to offer you a completely different reading, because I think the critics have the whole thing backwards. Think about what it means to not raise CUSMA on that call. It does not mean Carney forgot. It does not mean he was outmaneuvered. It means he made a deliberate choice not to put his biggest negotiating ask on the table during a conversation where Trump was also managing NATO commitments and an active situation in Iran and the broader Middle East, none of which had been resolved, all of which were consuming enormous political and diplomatic bandwidth in Washington. Carney is a man who ran the Bank of England through Brexit. He has sat in rooms where the pressure to say something, to fill the silence, to demonstrate that you are engaging with the problem is almost unbearable. And he has spent 20 years learning that the moment you give in to that pressure and say the thing before the moment is right, you have handed the room to whoever was patient enough to wait. He chose to have the conversation about Iran and NATO, to position Canada as a security partner rather than a trade problem, and to leave CUSMA for the moment when the conditions around it would allow it to be raised at leader level with the best possible chance of a real outcome. He told reporters exactly that. He said, "What I have seen with the president is that you are not close to making a deal, and then you make a deal. That is not a concession. That is a man who has read the other side carefully enough to know that the deal-making moment is not driven by calendar deadlines. It is driven by conditions. And the conditions were not ready on that call." Meanwhile, at his own press conference the next day, Carney made a statement that I think deserves far more attention than it received. He said, "We could sign a bad deal this afternoon. We could have signed a bad deal a year ago. We are not going to sign a bad deal, so it has to be a real deal." Read that sentence again slowly, because it contains something that most people miss. He was not just saying Canada will hold out for better terms. He was saying Canada has had the option to end this pain at any point in the last year by accepting bad terms, and it chose not to. That is not a country that is cornered. A cornered country does not describe the terms it turned down. It takes whatever is on the table because it does not believe it has a choice. The fact that Carney said this openly, calmly, at a public press conference 3 days before the deadline, while the U.S. ambassador was telling television cameras that the two sides were nowhere near a deal, tells you something important about who is actually more comfortable with uncertainty in this negotiation. And it is not the side that inserted, "I may sign it," into a termination statement at an airport. Let me also talk about what happened with the language around the annual review, because this has been framed almost everywhere as a concession Canada is being forced to accept, a kind of slow defeat dressed up in procedural language. The 16-year extension is off the table, the story goes. Canada is going to be stuck in rolling one-year reviews, living inside permanent uncertainty, never knowing whether the agreement will still be there next July. And I understand why that framing got traction, because uncertainty is painful and annual reviews sound like the opposite of stability. But here is what that framing misses. Annual reviews do not only create uncertainty for Canada, they create uncertainty for everyone operating across the North American market, which means American manufacturers, American agricultural exporters, American automakers, American technology companies, all of whom have built business plans around the assumption that the rules governing cross-border trade will be predictable. Every annual review is a moment where those businesses face potential disruption. Every annual review is a moment where American companies dependent on Canadian inputs or Canadian markets have to go back to their boards and explain why the most important trade relationship in the world is being renegotiated again. That is not a weapon pointed exclusively at Canada. That is a weapon pointed at the integrated North American economy, which means it is pointed at Michigan and Ohio as much as it is pointed at Ontario. The question is not whether annual reviews hurt Canada. They do. The question is who hurts more and faster? And on that question, the answer is considerably less clear than the headlines suggest. There is something I want to say about the structural shift that has happened over the past several months that almost never gets the attention it deserves, because it does not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens in trade missions and signed agreements and quiet ministerial meetings in Tokyo and Brussels and Kuala Lumpur. It happens in the slow accumulation of relationships and supply agreements and economic partnerships that do not generate a headline on their own, but collectively change the arithmetic of what the United States can credibly threaten. Canada's exports to non-American markets are up. The partnerships being built across Europe, across Asia, across the relationships that did not exist 2 years ago at the same depth or breadth, are not yet sufficient to replace the American market. Nobody honest is claiming they are, but they do not need to replace it entirely to change the negotiation. They only need to be real enough that the 75% figure starts having an asterisk. They only need to be credible enough that the next time someone holds up the dependency number and calls it a cage, Carney can point to the alternatives being built and say, the cage has a second door. And the moment that second door becomes visible, the entire pressure campaign has to recalibrate, because its whole logic rested on there being no other way out. This is the context inside which I may sign it sits. Not the context of an open-ended threat by a man with all the leverage. The context of a man who has been holding a threat for 18 months, whose own political party is starting to vote against it, whose own economy is showing the cost of it in the inflation numbers, whose own business community is lobbying against it in Congress, and who decided at the last moment on a tarmac in Paris to insert a conditional into a sentence about termination. That conditional is the tell. It is the tell that the bluff is hitting its ceiling. Not because Carney won an argument or made a better speech or outmaneuvered anyone in a dramatic public confrontation. Because the arithmetic underneath the threat has quietly been shifting for months. And at Orly Airport, for 8 seconds, you could hear Trump doing the math in real time. Let me be honest with you, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes this channel worth your time. None of this means the threat is gone. None of this means Canada has secured the outcome it wants, or that the July 1st deadline passes without genuine turbulence. The tariffs on steel and aluminum and softwood lumber are still real. The auto content demands are still a live issue that has not been resolved. The dairy question is still sitting on the table exactly where it has been sitting for years. And Trump is not the kind of person who signals retreat easily. If anything, the pattern of this trade fight suggests that when one line of pressure stops working, a new one gets opened, and the new one often comes from a direction nobody anticipated. So if you are looking for the part where I tell you the trade war is over, and Canada's sovereignty is secure, and the next few weeks are going to be easy, I do not have that part. That part does not exist yet. What I have is the honest red on where the leverage stands right now. And the honest red says that the may sign it is more significant than any of the Expire immediately statements that surrounded it, because threats are cheap and conditionals are expensive. Threats cost nothing to make. Conditionals cost you the image of certainty that the whole pressure campaign depends on. So here's the question I want you to sit with, because this is genuinely the question that is going to define the next chapter of this fight. When Trump says I may sign it after saying he would rather it expire immediately, is he revealing the outer edge of his leverage? Is that the moment the bluff shows itself? The moment the Orly Airport cameras caught him calculating the cost of actually pulling the trigger and deciding, almost involuntarily, to leave himself a way back? Or is it something more calculated than that? Is it deliberate ambiguity, a negotiating move designed to keep Canada guessing, to prevent Carney from walking into July 1st with too much confidence, to make sure that the uncertainty itself remains a weapon even as the termination threat softens? Because both of those readings are defensible. And the truth is, they are probably both partially true, which is the most uncomfortable answer and also the most honest one. What I can tell you is that after 18 months of this fight, the side that looks more comfortable with where things stand right now is not the one that spoke at Orly Airport and needed 8 seconds to contradict itself. The side that looks more comfortable is the one that had a phone call with the president, did not raise the trade deal, went to a press conference the next day, and said we are not going to sign a bad deal, and we never were. That posture does not come from desperation. It comes from knowing that the other side still needs a deal, even when they are standing on a tarmac telling the world they would rather walk away from it. The 8 seconds told you so. If you found this breakdown useful, if you saw something in those 8 seconds that the headlines did not give you, do me one favor and subscribe to Global Power Vision, because this is the kind of detail that is going to keep mattering as the review process moves forward and the next set of manufactured deadlines starts to be built. There is a lot more coming in the next few weeks, and the move underneath every move is exactly what we track here. Drop your take in the comments below. Do you think the May sign was a genuine tell, or is it exactly the kind of strategic ambiguity Trump deploys deliberately to keep everyone off balance? Tell me what you think, and I will see you in the next one.